Revelation chapter 8 is what we are going to be looking at this evening. Now this is a rather interesting crowd we got here. Well, you know, the Bible tells us that when we stand before God, that He is going to separate the sheep from the goats, and sheep are going to be on the right and the goats on the left. We got one sheep, one goat, and everybody else is just kind of lukewarm, walling around in the middle here. Yeah, have you noticed that, you know, while not to, you know, belittle God Himself because He is the Lamb of God, He does refer to us as His sheep. And if you know anything about sheep, sheep are dumb animals. They are very dumb. What he said. Yeah. Exactly. All right. Well, chapter 8 of Revelation, we are going to open the seventh seal this evening. We have looked so far at the seal judgments, and you'll recall that it is Christ who has stepped up to the plate, so to speak. Everybody was concerned, and John was upset that, well, there was nobody found who could open the seals, and said, wait, there's still one who can. We know that was Christ. We've gone through the first 6 seals, and now we're up to the point where Jesus opens the 7th and last seal. He says, when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. By the way, this is the second reference to an earthquake that we find here in the book of Revelation. We're going to stop here because then after that it begins the 7 trumpets. Now, there's 3 groups of judgments that are poured out on the earth. We started off with the 7 seals. With the opening of the 7 seals, then begins the 7 trumpets. And as we continue through, with each of these trumpet judgments, the judgments get worse and worse until finally, when the 7th trumpet is sounded, well, then we go on into, and depending upon which version of the Bible you're reading, it'll say the 7 bowl judgments, the 7 vial judgments, something to that effect, and we'll get more into that later on. So we have 3 groups of 7 judgments each. Now, what's interesting about how that's grouped together? You got 3 groups of 7. There you go. 7's the number of perfection. And why is 3 an important number? Because God's a triune being. So we have 3 groups of, if you want to call it this, perfect judgments that are poured out on the earth. Well, now, the 7th seal, as I mentioned there in verse 1, begins the 7 trumpet judgments. And the first thing that we see after the 7th seal is broken is silence in heaven for a half an hour. Why do you suppose that? John doesn't explain why. There's nothing here that says, oh, well, this was going on or that was going on. He just says, for a half an hour, there was nothing but silence. Anybody want to speculate? What's that, Al?
I just think it's fixing to ramp up.
Bernice? That's the general consensus of opinion. And again, John doesn't tell us, but the best way we can describe it that's probably going on here is the proverbial calm before the storm. you'll notice that with each seal judgment has been gradually, getting worse, and the implications with each one is getting bigger, broader. Well, now that we move on into the trumpet judgments, it's even going to get much worse. And by the way, the trumpet judgments are divided into two parts. We have a 4 and a 3, and we'll see the significance of that here shortly. We're going to cover the first 4 of these this evening, and then I doubt we'll get into chapter 9 tonight, but we'll begin with the 5th trumpet probably 2 weeks from now. But they're divided up into 2 groups, and yes, with each one, it gets worse and worse. And it's so far there's been I won't say confusion, but noisy, I guess is the way to say it. It's been noisy, there's a lot of activity going on, and now Jesus cuts the 7th seal, and it's like everybody is just silence. It's like almost, good illustration I can think of is, how many of you have ever been told by your mom, wait till your dad gets home? And when Daddy got home, what did you do? Did you run up and say, oh, I'm so glad to see you home. What are we going to do tonight? Are we going to watch TV? What did you do? You hid and you kept your mouth shut because you knew the storm was coming. I think that's kind of what's going on here, is everybody knows that it's fixing to rain some serious cats and dogs here, and there's just this silence of awe as all 7 seals have now been cut, and what is he going to do next? Well, as we look on in this, verses 3 through 5 might be the beginning of the pouring out of vengeance on behalf of the saints. You remember earlier we had seen 2 different times where the saints that had been martyred for their faith, the first time they were under the altar. You remember where they were the second time they were mentioned? Now they're standing in front of, not just around the throne, the church is around the throne, but those who had been martyred for their faith during the tribulation period, in the second reference to them, have now been given white robes, and they're standing before the throne. But they had been promised by God when they were under the altar. They said, Lord, how long are you going to let this go on? And he said, just be patient a little while longer until the number is complete, and then I'm going to deal with it. Well, then once they have been called out, they're standing before the throne. I can't help but wonder at this point if God has looked at them and said, guys, now I'm going to deal with it. And so we have then the beginning of these trumpets. Verse 3 says, another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. Now, we don't know specifically who this is, and there's some difference of opinion. Some say this is just another angel that has stepped forward. But there's also a strong possibility here that this is in fact a reference to Christ himself. That now Christ has stepped forward, because again, we see in our English translations the word angel, and often we read more into that than we should, because in the original Greek, what does the word angel mean? It's a messenger, which means it might be an angelic being, or it could be a messenger from God. Well, Jesus has often been referred to as God's personal messenger in the world because, well, throughout the Old Testament, we have the prophets that were sent to deliver a message, and when the prophets were all assassinated, ignored, or otherwise discounted, well then, who did God finally send as his personal messenger? What's that? Jesus himself. Well, now, to kind of lend some little bit of weight to this possibility, and again, I'm saying that, stress, this is a possibility. There's nowhere in John that it says that, yes, we can absolutely, without a doubt, attribute the identity of this other angel to Jesus. I'm just saying it's a possibility. Now, here's the first reason. As you look at what this angel is doing, what is he doing? All right? He's standing before the altar, isn't he? And as he stands before the altar, Larry, say it louder what he's doing. Offering incense, and then he takes that incense, and then what does he do with it? Offers up the prayers of the saints, and then he takes that and throws it on the earth, because again, what did God promise to those saints under the altar that he was going to do? Going to exact revenge on their behalf. And so now he's taken these prayers of the saints. Now how these prayers are given embodiment, we don't know. I mean, that's for God to figure out and us just to see when we get there. But somehow these prayers are somehow contained, and that God is now taking these, throwing them down to the earth, and then of course we see this great conflagration, and Connie said I shouldn't use that word. All this mess that's beginning to happen. How's that? Is that better? All this mess that starts down there on earth. Well, now, let me ask you this. What did a priest do in the Old Testament? And, what's that? They slaughtered animals, but why did they do that? They sacrificed. What did Jesus do as the ultimate high priest? He sacrificed. Who stands before the altar of God today? What do you see this angel doing? He's standing before the altar of God in heaven. That's why many people believe that while it's identified as an angel or a messenger of God, that this is none other than Jesus himself, because what he is doing is exactly what a high priest would be doing, isn't it? Here's the second possibility. And if you want to look this up, you will find this in Genesis chapter 32, beginning in verse 22. Now, I'm not going to look this up because probably most of you in here are familiar with this story. But it was dark, late at night, and Jacob had a wrestling match with somebody. You remember the story? All right. As you read Genesis chapter 32, what did it describe, or how did it describe the person Jacob was wrestling with? Some versions of the Bible say man, but most of them say an angel. Now, I know that angel was the pre-incarnate Jesus. Anybody want to take a wild guess at how we know that? There you go. He got renamed Israel. Now, in fact, that very night, that angel gave him a new name. Now, what's the Hebrew word for God? El? And there's your El right there. Israel in Hebrew means to wrestle or struggle with God. That's why he was given that name. Notice it doesn't say anything at all here in his new name that he struggled with an angel. And do we see anywhere in the Bible an example of an angel blessing humanity? Somebody give me just one example of an angel that blesses us. There aren't any. But how many times do we see God blessing us? Multiple times. And Jacob said, I'm not going to let you go until you do what? Till you bless me. And he said, fine, you are blessed. And we know that, in fact, happened because after that, no matter how much devilment Jacob got into, he lived a blessed life after that. And he became the father of the Israelites. But that evening, that angel told him, I'm going to give you a new name. Now, of course, the Bible tells us that Jacob held on to him and said, you need to let me go because the sun's coming up. Now, could God have just simply said, Jacob, get off of me? Or he could have just disappeared. Why do you suppose he didn't? Why does God do anything? Is it arbitrary? It's all part of the plan. When God approached Adam in the Garden of Eden and said, Adam, where are you? Did God not know where Adam was? So for whose benefit was the question? It was for Adam. To bring to Adam's understanding that it was a rhetorical question that, Adam, you're hiding. Make Adam realize that something was wrong here. The whole reason that the angel wrestled with Jacob was that it was all part of God's plan. God could easily have just threw Jacob off, could have disappeared, but he didn't. He allowed him to wrestle with him and then later changed his name. But anyway, to bring all that full circle, the Bible never says in there that this was God himself. It says he was wrestling with some angel. But yet God blessed him and renamed him, you've wrestled with God. So there is a precedent in the Bible for Jesus to be referred to as an angel. Now, I've had some people say that, well, every place in the Bible that he's referred to as an angel, it says that he's the head or angel of the host of the Lord. That's one title. But this one example, Jacob, is clearly one example that we have when we know it had to have been the pre-incarnate Christ, that he was just called an angel because Jacob wasn't sure, or Moses or whoever it was. So now here in Revelation, we have another example where it just says there was some angel that stepped up and here's what he did. My personal opinion is I think this in fact was Jesus because of the fact that he performs high priestly duties as he's standing before the altar. And he's also fulfilling his promise to those martyred saints who had been under the altar. All right, then verse 5 says, the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it on the earth, and there were peals of thunder, rumblings, or voices, and some translations say flashes of lightning and an earthquake. Guess what has now come to an end? What's that? Well, that's true. But there in heaven, remember it said there was a silence for half an hour? Not silent now. Now it's getting noisy. All right. Having done that, and in this ushering in, if you will, the 7 trumpet judgments, now it says we've got 7 angels that have been given these 7 trumpets with the breaking of this 7th seal, and now we move on to the second set of judgments. Verse 6. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. Then I looked, And I heard an eagle. And by the way, here, if you're reading from the King James, it says an angel. A lot of the other translations say an eagle, crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth at the blast of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow." I'll come back and look at this more here in a minute, but for verse 13, the difference between eagle and angel, I don't know why the King James translates that as angel, unless it was simply a choice by the translators, but I went back up and read it in the original Hebrew. The Hebrew word does in fact say it was an eagle, for whatever that's worth. All right, now, as we look at these, the first four of these 7 trumpets. Said the first one, this is back at verse 7, said, blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. 1/3 of the earth was burned up, 1/3 of the trees, and all green grass. Look, if you will, in Exodus chapter 9. In Exodus chapter 9, looking at verses 22 and 23, this is whenever Moses had gone before Pharaoh, and says, "The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, so that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, on man and beast and every plant of the field in the land of Egypt." Then Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire ran down to the earth. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. Do you see a parallel there? Many of the judgments that will be poured out on the earth during the Revelation period mirror the exact judgments that God poured out on Egypt whenever Moses had gone to Pharaoh and said, God says, let my people go. Why do you think there's a parallel? And we're going to see more as we go on here. This is just the first one. What do they have in common? That's part of it. But, all right. But consider this. When the Israelites were in Egypt, what was their social condition? What's that? Slaves. They were slaves. In the tribulation period, what is their social condition? Or, should say, spiritual condition now. Not social, but spiritual. What's that? Yeah, they're still slaves. They have not accepted Christ, and if you don't have Christ, you're a slave to sin, aren't you? So, in Egypt, God was negotiating, if you want to call it negotiating. It was more that He was heavy, being a little heavy-handed on him, giving him some ultimatums, to let Israel go because Egypt had them in slavery. In the tribulation period, they're not in Egypt physically, but they're in Egypt spiritually. Because if they're in disobedience to God, as Mel mentioned, they're in spiritual slavery. And so instead of negotiating with Pharaoh, we're now negotiating with who? What's that? The Antichrist, the world system as a whole, because they're the ones who have... The Antichrist now is enslaving Israel. Because remember, we're no longer in the church age here. We have gone back to complete the covenants with Israel. And Israel is still on the earth. They're in spiritual slavery. And God is negotiating, and I hesitate to use the word negotiate, but I really can't think. Orchestrating, that's the word I'm looking for. That God is orchestrating their release from spiritual slavery. And so we see here the first of a parallel plague poured out on the earth that was also poured out originally on Egypt. Then, verse 8 says, the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. By the way, notice we've already burned up a third of the earth. Now we're turning a third of the water into blood. If you look in Exodus chapter 7, I won't read it here because if you still got your finger on it, you can look back up. But in Exodus chapter 7, verses 19 through 21, you want to take a wild guess which plague was poured out on Egypt at that point? They turned the water into blood. An exact parallel to what's going on here. God has turned the water into blood. Well, now let's look at the literal reading of verse 8 here. It says something like a great mountain. Anybody want to take a wild guess what they think that might be? Good possibility. I've had some people say, well, they think it might be an exploding volcano. That would be a remote possibility except for one thing. Keep in mind, in this whole book, John is describing events that he is seeing that are happening in at least 2,000 years to his future, using vocabulary of someone who's lived or was living in the first century, and trying to give it the best shot he could, describing what will be to us even later modern events with a first century vocabulary. But here's the problem. Did they have volcanoes in the first century? Sure they did. I can think of one very prominent volcano that was there in Italy that John probably would have been quite familiar with. Whether he personally saw it or not, I couldn't tell you, but I'm sure he knew of its existence. Anybody remember? Pompeii. So my point here is, had it been an exploding volcano, do you think John would have said it was an exploding volcano? Probably so. He could have described that, but he doesn't say that. So I think those that claim, oh, well, this was an exploding volcano and raining back down, I don't think that holds any water for that reason. John could easily have described that. But instead he says there was this great mountain coming down. It was on fire and it hit the water and a third of the water became blood. That sounds to me like, as Al mentioned, a pretty good sized meteorite. Now, if indeed a meteorite, or anything for that matter, a great mountain meteorite or whatever, if it's big enough and it struck the water, guess what else is going to happen after that? A big tidal wave. Now, where on the earth it would have struck would be speculation. My guess, probably the Mediterranean. Why do you think the Mediterranean? Because to John, his frame of reference would have been the Mediterranean world. And when we're talking Jerusalem, which, let's face it, everything in the Bible, geographically speaking, points to where? Jerusalem. And what's the big body of water that Jerusalem would be interested in? The Mediterranean. So my guess is probably this meteorite would have struck the Mediterranean, said it was burning with fire, which certainly sounds to me like a meteor coming through the atmosphere. So it was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. Now we don't know at this point, was this some natural event that caused the sea to turn to blood, or did God do it supernaturally? Don't have any speculation there. But I can tell you this much. It's a parallel to what happened in Egypt, and my guess is that while God may use some natural event to bring it about, I don't discount at all the possibility that God is going to miraculously turn the water to blood. In any event, one thing we can be sure of, the water supply, what happens to it? Yep. Can't drink it. It's gone. And what happens to the fish that are there? It's going to be a stench because there's going to be dead fish all over the place. Anybody that's lived in Florida or coastal areas in Florida knows what a whole bunch of dead fish smells like when they start washing up. Yeah. Red tide, that's a good possibility. There could be one massive red tide. Because, of course, the water actually looks like blood when it's a red tide. And what happens in a red tide? Yeah, fish die, everything dies, and it stinks. And you can't even get anywhere close to it. All right. Verse 10. Oh, before we go on, I almost overlooked verse 9 here. So notice it says a third of the living creatures in the sea died. Well, we can pretty well take that for granted. Because whether it's a red tide, whether it's miraculously turned to blood or whatever, whatever's in it is going to die. But it says, notice also a third of the ships were destroyed. You know what that confirms to me? By the way, I read somewhere that, now, of course, we don't have an exact figure, but if you take all of the merchant ships that are registered worldwide and add the known military ships to that, the figure that I read was worldwide, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45,000 ships. Now, we're not talking little boats, but ships. About 45,000 worldwide. It says here a third of the ships are going to be destroyed. Well, first off, did anybody know where the American Sixth Fleet is located? Mediterranean. Well, if you got a third of the world's ships destroyed, what does that confirm for you that probably will take place? We just talked about it. A big tidal wave. There's going to be a tsunami of major proportions. Now, normally, if anybody knows anything about a tsunami, if you were out in open water, a tsunami can go right by a ship and you barely even notice it because all you kind of get is a little bump and it goes right on by you. It doesn't really get nasty until you start getting close to shore as the sea floor begins to rise up. And naturally, at the same time, the wave begins to get big, and that's where all your devastation is. So that tells us either the ships are all in port, or this is going to be a tidal wave of such magnitude that even ships out on open water are going to be sunk by it. My personal opinion, probably the second one. Because if we have a massive meteorite striking the Mediterranean Sea, it's going to cause major devastation. You're beginning to also see the condition of the world's economy at this particular point. Good point. What economy? By the way, while we haven't gotten that far yet in Revelation, John has not addressed this issue yet. It's one of those things where he goes back and kind of fills in the details later, which we'll get to here in about 2 or 3 chapters. But John tells us that during this period of time, nobody would be able to buy or sell anything unless they have the mark of the beast. And of course, we can see now that we're gradually moving toward a cashless society now. There's places that, of course, you can do business with now that flat out won't accept cash. It's either plastic or electronic transfer, or you don't do business with them. As we get to this point where, as Marianne mentioned, it's like what economy is left? Cash will be meaningless. Like, what difference does that make? Probably, the euro, which is, one of the world's major economic or monetary units, rather. You've got the British pound, the American dollar. All of those are going to be in collapse. Because of, a third of the population's gone. You've just had a third of the merchant and military fleets sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean or somewhere. You got the seafood industry shot. All your favorites, wherever your favorite seafood restaurant is, eat it up now because it ain't going to be in business come this time. All right. Now we go on to verse 10. Said a third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. All right, now, this great star. I've heard some people say, oh, well, that's a reference to Satan, because there is later a reference to Satan being kicked out of heaven, and he fell like a star from heaven. There's some that say, well, this is a reference to Satan. I don't think this is that reference or can be equated to later on when Satan comes out, for two or three reasons. Number one is John mentions later about Satan, that he saw, that Satan comes from heaven. Jesus even mentions earlier, that in one of his prophecies said that he saw a star, or saw the Satan fall like a star from heaven. If this is Satan here, well, then he'd have to go back and fall again later on. That isn't going to happen. Other reason is there's some other issues behind why Satan gets kicked out of heaven later on. If that had been the case at this point, I have no doubt John would have mentioned it. But John doesn't. He just simply states, well, I saw this star fall from heaven. This could also be another possible meteorite, or maybe even something larger like a comet. Don't know. By the way, before I go on, let me tell you one of the reasons why I think that Satan will be kicked out later, but not at this particular point. Right now, this day, what does it tell us that Satan's, other than tempting us and roaming around to see what kind of devilment he can get into, what is Satan doing? What is his job, if he's got a job? Al? He stands before the throne of God condemning us, and said he accuses us day and night. Well, if Satan is accusing us, who's defending us? Jesus is. Who's going to judge us? Oh, come on, be more specific. Not just God. Specifically the second person of the Trinity, Jesus. Well, and I've mentioned this to you before, but for the sake of argument, I'll remind you of this. If you're standing in court and your own defense attorney is doubling as the judge, anyone to take any bets on whether or not the prosecution's going to win? Don't think so. Our attorney is also the judge, Jesus. But yet, Satan's persistent. If nothing else, he's a stubborn cuss. And he stands up there, the Bible tells us, day and night accusing us of everything that that he can think of. Well, when judgment is done, is there any continuing reason after that for Satan to be standing before the throne accusing us? What is he there to accuse us of if Jesus has already sounded the gavel and said, innocent, there's no sin? It's done. I believe that's the reason that at one point Satan is kicked out of heaven. Now you may think, well, Satan doesn't have access to heaven. What's Satan doing in heaven? Well, there's two things that we know he does have access to heaven. Number one is, how can he stand before the throne accusing us if he doesn't have access to heaven? That's number one. Number two, you read Job chapters 1 and 2. Who came into the presence of God that God said, have you considered my servant Job? Satan. Satan does have access to heaven. He doesn't live there. He doesn't get to stay there, but he's got access. Well, when the time comes that the judgment day is over with, and he is no longer allowed to accuse us day and night, and God says, Satan, you're done. Get out and take your horde with you. What do you think is going to happen on earth at that point? Because now, the covering cherub, who has, since the beginning of creation, had access to the throne room of God, now he's just been kicked out of the house. Do you think he's going to be happy about that? Oh, it's going to be rough on the earth, because, well, what happens when a bully doesn't get his way? If I'm a bully and I start to pick on Charles over here, and Charles lets me have it and decks me out, Well, I'm not going to mess with him anymore because he's bigger than me. But what am I going to do to Brian behind him over here? I'm going to pick on Brian instead. He's bigger than me too. But you get the idea. If he can't get away with it in heaven, he's going to take it out on God's people on earth. Now you're beginning to see why it's going to be so rough here on the earth. It's not just the judgments of God that are being poured out. It's Satan pouring out his wrath on God's people. Now, we'll get in a whole lot more detail about that later on when we start talking about the dragon and, specifically the nation of Israel. But this kind of paints the picture for you as to what will happen. And also one of the reasons I don't think this reference has anything to do with Satan. I think this reference is exactly what it says it was. A great star, whether it's, comet or whatever, we don't know. But it says a great star fell from heaven blazing like a torch. But now here's the interesting thing. It said it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. Whatever this is, it's big. Or, here's the other possibility. What a lot of times happens to a large meteorite, or actually it's not even a meteorite yet, it's still a meteor. By the way, anybody know the difference between a meteor and a meteorite? Oh, yeah, once it hits the ground, then it's a meteorite. Well, when a meteor is coming through the atmosphere and it starts heating up because of the friction with the atmosphere, what happens to it a lot of times? Breaks up, and you might have, from one meteor, now you got 1,000. Or, here's the other possibility. What's that look like? Yeah, it becomes a mushroom. Can you imagine, I don't know how many of you are really that familiar with atomic weapons, but most of these missiles that both us, the Soviets, what other countries have them, when they carry an atomic warhead, it's not just one warhead. A lot of them have multiple warheads. It goes up with one missile, but once it leaves the atmosphere, before it comes back down, or as it's coming down, it will split up, and you will have multiple warheads coming down at different spots. So one missile can actually hit numerous different targets. Now, as it's coming back down, imagine if John in his vision looked up and he sees this ball of fire coming down into the atmosphere, and then still while it's high in the atmosphere, it splits up, and one warhead goes over here, one bomb over here, one bomb over here. Is it possible that's what he's describing? I'm betting that it is, because keep reading. Look what happens next. Verse 11 says the name of this star is wormwood. And a third of the waters became wormwood, and people died from the water because it had been made bitter. All right, let me tell you what any of you know, what's that? Yes, it was. Anybody want to take a wild guess at what the Russian word for wormwood is? Chernobyl. What happened at Chernobyl? Yep, nuclear meltdown. And over there in Russia, they still, actually, I don't think it's in Russia, I think it's in Chernobyl is actually in Ukraine, wasn't it? They don't allow anybody within about 10 miles of that place because it's still radioactive, deadly radioactive, and expected to be so for the next 100 years before the radiation finally peters out. Well, wormwood is it's an herb, a plant that, number one, in its raw form is deadly poisonous. Even when it's been purified and the deadly's been taken out of it, it's still very bitter. But the point being here, raw wormwood taken as is will kill you. And here in the Bible where it says that this wormwood said the waters became bitter, and that said people died because of it. The word that's actually translated bitter in your Bible, I went and looked it up. That word has two meanings to it. Bitter is one. Anybody want to guess what the second meaning is? Poisonous. It's bitter because it's poisonous. And that's why so many people died from it. What happens to the water when it's exposed to nuclear radiation? Go back to Chernobyl. Ask them. They got people over there that even though it's been like 25, 30 years ago now, there's people still dying over there from radiation poisoning. And it'll probably be that way for years from now. What John is describing here in the words that he used is indicating not just bitter water, but poisonous water that has been made poisonous because of the effect of this star falling down from heaven. What John has described is a nuclear fallout. Now, if you're thinking, well, John didn't say that, keep in mind, John didn't have a clue what a nuclear weapon was. He'd never seen anything like that. There was no word in the first century vocabulary in anybody's language to describe nuclear fallout. But that's pretty much what John's describing. All right, it's 7 o'clock now. We're going to pick up with the fourth angel here in a couple of weeks.